Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Abigail Dauber Sterne has worked in the United States and in Israel as an educator and organizational leader for more than 20 years. Throughout her career, her focus has been on deepening people's Jewish experiences while also promoting a robust pluralism amongst those who live in community together. She's held senior management roles at two international organizations I know you've heard of, Hillel International and the Jewish Agency for Israel's Makom, Israel Education Lab. And she's worked with rabbis, students, educators, and organizational leaders around the world. Abby is a recipient of several fellowships in the Jewish communal world, including, most recently, the Schusterman Fellowship. And she's currently a rabbinical student at the Shalom Hartman Institute HaMidrasha at Oranim. Abby lives in Jerusalem with her spouse and 4 children. And since we are today talking about the power of honest argument, I should mention that Abby's family's dinner table is always a raucous mixture of laughter and disagreement. Welcome, Abby. It's great to see you. And you're in Jerusalem. Let's just, full disclosure, why you're not in the studio. I wish you were, but it's great to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell us about this book that we are here to talk about today. Its title and its gestation. What made you want to write it? And I know you have a co-author.
Yes, Stories for the Sake of Argument, written by me and my colleague and friend, Robbie Greengrass. What made us want to write it is the realization of two things. One, that people have forgotten the art of healthy argument. And two, that there's a lot to argue about when it comes to Israel. And put those two things together, and we realize that if we want people to think about Israel, engage with Israel, teach Israel, they need to know how to both argue and also how to talk about the most difficult things, because both of those come together. If you're going to talk about difficult things, you're going to have to argue about them.
You raised the point of how hard it is to actually argue with each other, talk to each other right now. Can you kind of encapsulate why that's so heightened in terms of that difficulty? Why are we having so much trouble engaging?
There are several factors, and there's been a lot written about this. One is the social media culture that's really been the maybe major change over the last 10 years, that we often hear each other in sound bites. And so the moment somebody puts a sound bite out there in the world, it's as though we've captured an entire person's ideas or ideology. Even though deep down we know it's really not true, as soon as it's out there on social media, whatever one you choose, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc., it's captured and frozen in time. It will be there. And it creates a certain way of being in the world where everything we say somehow matters more than it used to. And not just matters more, but we imagine that it encapsulates somebody in a way that, of course, we know it doesn't. But somehow that encapsulation leads to sort of greater polarization or making statements greater extreme. So that's one of the factors. I think another factor is the world that we live in also over the last maybe 5 years, maybe 10, with words and concepts like intersectionality. We can talk about what that means for the viewers who don't know. For issues of justice, social justice, issues fighting against racism, all very important issues to talk about and to change. But what's happened is people have become very wary of making statements because they're afraid they're going to get accused of one of those bad things. And we don't want to make a statement that a racist statement. We don't want to be racist. And occasionally we say something that might sound, and all of a sudden we got into a big argument.
And you talk about a kind of paralysis when it comes to a fear of essentially being canceled or having a footprint you can't erase, being held to assumptions based on one statement or one tweet. Can you talk about it particularly with the frame of Israel? How do you see the discussion around Israel or Zionism being especially a flashpoint when it comes to that fear?
Yeah. So one of the drivers in life, one of the drivers in life, I think, for each of us is that we want to belong. Belonging is a human desire and a human need. And Israel is something that for many of us, particularly Jews who live in Jewish communities or interact with other Jews and also non-Jews, Israel becomes part of our community and part of our communal discussion. And if I say something that isn't in line with people in my community, with my friend group, Jews and non-Jews, my colleagues at work, if I say something that isn't in line with them, suddenly I don't belong. I've sort of taken myself out, even inadvertently. And so it becomes quite paralyzing. And Israel, in many ways, is a sort of wedge issue because it's become a topic that is often associated with issues relating to racial justice. Though many of us don't see it that way, it has become aligned. The fight for Palestinian rights, Palestinian freedoms, has become aligned very much with issues of racism. And I think that has become a sort of wedge issue that didn't used to be the case. And so that both that desire for belonging and also sort of alignment of ideology, because it's easier when our ideology is aligned, has created more tension around Israel.
So Abby, tell me about the structure of the book. There's 24 stories. Where do they come from, and why the stories as a kind of springboard to argument?
Stories are the most accessible form of literature. Short stories can be read quickly, that's why they're short. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge in order to access them. And if written well, they can be read aloud, sort of theatrically. And so from an educational perspective, the idea of a short story enables people to sort of dip in. People who are a little afraid maybe of talking about Israel, people who are a little afraid maybe of getting into an argument, it's okay, it's only a page and a half. We can do this, we can read it. It's not just for adults, it's also for kids. Of course you can do this. And so there's a sort of sense that from an educational perspective, that stories can really help people access Israel in a way they couldn't otherwise.
Can you give an example of one? I wish we had time to read one, but they are digestible and they are provocative. And one of the things I saw your colleague said, which I loved, is that you chose stories where each side of the argument could be equally robust, equally compelling. And that ultimately, I think, is the best argument there is. It doesn't feel like you are weighting the story towards a right answer.
That's certainly what we tried to do. And in fact, there were stories that we wrote and had to stop in the middle because one of us couldn't make the other argument. If we felt that we couldn't make both sides, right, both of the arguments, then we nixed it from the book. So that's certainly the case. Stories. One of the stories I like about issues of religion and state is a story about a grandmother whose daughter comes and visits her every Shabbat in Haifa. And Haifa is the only city in Israel where there are buses on Shabbat. And so the granddaughter comes and visits her grandmother and makes Shabbat for her. And one week the grandmother says, "You can come visit me, I love it, but don't take a bus. Israel shouldn't have buses on Shabbat. Take a taxi instead, I'll pay for it." And so there's a whole question of why taxi better than a bus, right? And I could write an argument, and we give background information also. There's the story and then some background to help process and understand a few more facts about this. But a difference that an argument one could make as well, a bus is nationally sponsored, and in a Jewish state, we don't want to do anything that would break a Jewish idea, a Jewish concept, a Jewish value. Is one argument. We could take the Savta, the grandmother, who's saying, actually, it's not about whether or not individuals drive on Shabbat. She doesn't care if individuals drive, but she wants to keep some sort of feeling, some sort of atmosphere. And there's lots of questions that ensue and conversations that can be had around that. So that's one example.
And there's always questions that follow the story. Can you talk about the questions? Are they kind of prompts for the family discussion or the student debate?
Exactly. They're prompts. They're usually on different levels. They're the questions that are very much about the text itself, about do you side with Savta, with the grandmother, or do you side with the granddaughter? What perspective do you take? But then we also take it to the next level to ask the larger question of, are there symbols that are important to you, even though on an individual level you might not care? Right. So we try and take it both the very literal read of the story and then to take it to broader issues, both about Israel and often more existential issues about our own lives.
Can you talk about another story that gets to essentially home ownership and who it belongs to?
Yeah, it's really about land ownership and who does land belong to. So it's a story where a guy and his men come and they get to a piece of land and they make camp. They set up camp, and then lo and behold, somebody else comes with his guys and say, "Hey, this is my land." And guy number one says, "What are you talking about? I'm here. It's mine." And the guy says, "No, no, 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 no." So guy number one, right, got there says, "Well, how's this land yours?" And the guy says, "Well, it was my father's." "How is it your father's?" "It was my grandfather's." "How is it your grandfather?" "My grandfather's." "It was my great grandfather's." "And how did they each get it?" asks guy number one. Guy number two says, "Well, they fought. They fought for it." And guy number one says, "Want to fight me?" Right. So this idea of fighting for it, it's much better in the story. I sort of killed it by not reading it.
It was pretty good, Abby. It was pretty good. I put you on the spot.
The idea there is how does land become rightfully owned? And not just, an individual house where today we purchase, but land as in countries used to be conquered, used to be fought, we used to take them over in wars. And of course, that's a real major issue here in this country in Israel. How was this land won? And in fact, it wasn't only land through wars. It was won through UN votes and all the mess surrounding all of that. But the real question of how has land legitimately become a country or become owned by anybody?
So you say that this is not a political book, or it's not partisan, I should say, is I think your contention. And when I hear a story like that, my gut is telling me you're asking me to be uncomfortable with the Jewish claim of ownership. That's what's kind of coming into my mind, that at least I should be wrestling with it. So have you gotten any pushback from some maybe more on the right who say, why are you making these questions, which seem to be leading people to more kind of internal doubt than they should have?
So I'll say two things. First, that particular story, we actually share history also of Mexico and land rights in the U.S. So we ask it everywhere. It is not only a question about Israel. We make sure that's it. And so I think that's one of the things we're trying to do is quite the opposite. Is say, don't just look at Israel and point fingers. Sure, there is lots of mess and lots of things that are wrong, and let's talk about that too. But also, let's look at the other sides. And so, what we try and look at all the directions. I would say I've only had one person tell me that the book leaned too left, and the person who told me that is Israeli, and he felt he said to me even maybe it's too American. I don't know what that means. I would let our viewers judge for themselves and argue over it. Many of us have grown up with this idea of arguments for the sake of heaven as a Jewish value. Can you, just as a rabbi in training, and I know you have deep Jewish knowledge of text, just kind of orient us to that piece of our tradition? Yes. So the idea of our argument for the sake of heaven is a Mishnah, a rabbinic text that really talks about that an argument that is for the sake of heaven is one that in the end continues in a fruitful way. The word is lahitz kayem, sort of becomes or exists, and that's all sorts of explanations of what that means. But I actually prefer a different text. I prefer a text of Rabbi Nachman, who's a Hasidic master. And
of Bratslav.
Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, thank you. Bratslav is in Ukraine. And he was a master storyteller himself. And he writes that machloket, which is the Hebrew word for disagreement or argument, that disagreement is an aspect of creation. Disagreement is an aspect of creation, he says. And he learns that from the very act, a godly act in Genesis. What does God do when God creates the world? God creates divisions, creates separations, right? Water from sky, land, right? All the divisions, dark and light, the divisions that God creates. And divisions, the Hebrew word for divisions is lachlok, lachalek, to separate. And that word chalek is in the word machloket. It's the same word.
Oh, I love that.
Divisions and arguments are the same. And the very creative act, the first creative act that God made was to divide. And in fact, it was the very division, says Rabbi Nachman, those divisions are necessary for any kind of space, for any creative act. God had to make space, right? And the only way to make space was to start creating and dividing. And he goes on, but I'll leave it at
Beautiful.
that.
I love it. You're also giving us tools. I mean, we don't have to talk about the cliches of Jews and disputation, or arguing at whether it's the Seder table or the Thanksgiving table. But what are the tools that you're recommending, or that this book offers us, in terms of kind of how to chart a more civil course?
So, what tools do we give? The book itself doesn't give as many tools. In some ways, the stories themselves are the tool. The story is the tool with the questions, and that really is enough. In the trainings that we have developed since then, we offer several tools, but I'll give you one, and I think it works in many different contexts. We think of arguments in three different categories. Really, there are three types of arguments. The first is debate. And a debate, the goal of a debate is to win. I want to convince you, I want to win. The second type of argument is negotiation. And the goal of a negotiation is to agree. Usually requires compromise, giving up of myself just to agree. So we got debate is to win, negotiation is to agree. And the third type is what we're calling healthy argument. And there the goal is to learn and to grow.
I want to make sure I heard that third category. What's the name of it?
Healthy argument.
Healthy argument. Okay.
You're calling it healthy argument, right? Where the goal is to grow or to learn. And if you take that idea that in any kind of conversation we're in, or a lot of conversations, particularly if it's about an issue that we disagree about, we could be in any one of those three. One isn't better or worse. But there are times where I'm sitting at my own table and I can see the debate happening. This child is yelling at that child and they just want to win. Or my uncle comes over and he has very different views than I do and he just wants to win. And it's not going to happen. We almost never convince anybody through a conversation. That's just not how our brains work and our feelings work. And so I have that moment where I say, I don't want to be in a debate. I want to understand, why is he saying this? What is going on? And then all of a sudden my conversation shifts and I ask different questions. I ask why questions. I ask curiosity questions. And it's a very different kind of conversation. So that's sort of our one major rule of thumb.
And what about the idea of convincing? Like, is there supposed to be an outcome to this argument? And talk a little bit about consensus. Is that maybe kind of a false value in your mind?
Great question. I think convincing is completely fine in certain settings, but it's rare for one person to convince another, or a couple of people to convince another in the course of a dinner conversation or any kind of conversation. It's just not how it works. In a formal debate where somebody can say you win and you lose, where there are judges, it's a different story. But in a regular conversation, it almost never happens. And so I don't think it's bad. I just think it's exhausting. And so for me, I'm not so interested in it. I'm much more interested in the why do you think what you think than trying to prove you wrong. And in terms of consensus, I think consensus can be really valuable. But what the problem with consensus is, it often hides. There's sort of hidden feelings or ideas that we might have. So I'm willing to be part of some kind of consensus, to go back to the idea I started with, right, with belonging. Consensus is good for the feeling of belonging. But often there's that nagging part of me that says, I don't 100% agree, but I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to not belong. And so I don't say it. And the interesting paradox, of course, is the minute I'm holding that inside, I start feeling like I don't belong. And so I think consensus is wonderful when there's real negotiation. So if it's just a conversation.
That's great. If you were brought in now as a kind of macro educator for this moment in Israel, when I'm interviewing you after 3 months of protests, you wrote this book, Prejudicial Reform. How would you lead the Israeli community, let's put the American Jewish community aside for a minute, through this in terms of some of the tenets that your book is getting at? Like, are these arguments happening in a healthy way?
No. So, and there are several initiatives here in Israel also thinking about this question. The issue in Israel is less about not being willing to argue, as I spoke about. I think in North America, it's much more people don't want to rock the boat or are afraid, what the penalty. In Israel, it's much more about how people argue. Arguing can get really ugly, really mean, really screamy and loud. And I think here it's much more about the tools. How can we help people have better conversations around difficult issues?
When you say screaming, I mean, I just want to understand what ugly looks like. Is it personal? Is it public? Is it in the press? I mean, kind of ugly arguing in America probably looks a little different than what you're describing.
Yeah, so I'm thinking certainly about what's happening in Knesset, right, in Parliament here, where things have almost come to blows. People have had to be held back physically.
Wow.
Now, what I will say is they're really negotiating. They're not having a healthy argument. They need to come to a decision. And so the stakes are different. But I'll take a classroom. A classroom in Israel is a louder place than in America. People are less well behaved. They are willing to make outrageous statements and yell back at each other and point fingers and call names. Happens all the time. And that I don't think is healthy or productive. And so the tools that we're developing, I would love to see in Israeli schools in particular, and youth movements and sort of educational settings, in the hopes of it also influencing in the long run Knesset and politics and other settings.
So finally, Abby, I would just love you to kind of tell us how it changes us to be able to argue robustly, and maybe to argue differently.
Yeah. It changes us by making us able to listen and speak differently. Often in related fields, when we talk about conflict management and negotiation, active listening is an incredibly important skill. And for us, it's also very important. But I would say for what we're working on, we are also working on the active speaking, the gentle, polite speaking, the asking good questions speaking. And the way it changes us, the way it's changed me, and maybe I'll talk most about me, is I started to think in stories. And what I mean by that is when I read a newspaper article or when I hear of some controversial issue, I start to imagine, how would I write a story about this? And the act of writing the story isn't just the story. It's about, how do I see different perspectives? If I were this character, what would I say? If I were that character, what would I say? And suddenly I have multiple narratives in my head. And that's how it's changed me, it's become the skill of how do I see the different characters and the different perspectives.
But even with that empathy, I want to make clear before we go that you're not actually advocating a kind of kumbaya,
No.
kind of coming together and not even having the passion that one might have for their beliefs. You're still actually saying we should get into it and not so much worry about how the temperature rises. So even though you're saying let's not scream at each other, you're not saying back down from convictions. So kind of
Correct.
help us just understand kind of what would be the ideal outcome if we kind of reset the table here.
Yeah, the ideal outcome is that in all settings, but particularly educational ones, which, by the way, I consider my dinner table an educational, setting as well, that we'd be willing to raise controversial issues, that we'd be willing to say, gosh, there's this thing going on and it's driving me crazy and I don't know what to do about it, rather than being afraid to mention it for fear that I'm going to get yelled at. But actually that we can raise the issues that are most important to us, right? The reason we chose the word argument is because it's about the heart and the head.
Great.
It's really about both. We want ideas and we want feelings. And I want to bring that to the world and to our conversations.
Thank you, Abi Dauber Sterne. The book is Stories for the Sake of Argument. Abi, tell us how someone can find the website. And if they want to create, what do you have, argument circles?
Yes, you can create your own. You can bring us in.
Yes, bring Abi in. That would be a treat. Gosh, I would love to, get you over here. We need you. So what's the website?
forthesakeofargument.org.
forthesakeofargument.org. We will put it on the screen. Thanks to Abi Dauber Sterne. Thanks to all of you for tuning in to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin, and I'll see you next time.